Thank you all for coming to this training session. I wish we were in Rwanda, but Zoom will do, I guess. So this is a training session on collecting and reporting the costs of conservation interventions. And it's a 2-day session. So today we'll go through a lot of content, and then tomorrow we will do some exercises and have opportunities for discussion and questions about your context. So this session was developed with support from the Arthur and Elaine Johnson Foundation and the ASU Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. So my name is Gwenna Akona. I'm Assistant Director for the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes at ASU, and also an Assistant Research Professor in the School of Life Sciences there. So I've been doing a lot of work on conservation for the past 15 years or so, and have really gotten into sort of work on conservation costs and conservation costing in the past decade or so. So this course I developed with the help of several students in our group at ASU. And so in particular, Camila Guerrero-Pinada has developed quite a lot of the content that you'll be seeing today and tomorrow. She sadly, well, happily is not joining us because she is getting married. So she has pre-recorded a lot of content and I will work through it, but we can also send her emails next week if there's specific questions. Erin Murphy is also a PhD student in the department who has developed some of the work that we'll be talking about today, as is Katie Surrey, another PhD student who will be joining us later today to talk about her work. Jared Clements is my research assistant, and he helped me put together all of these PowerPoints and videos that we're going to attempt to make work today. I also had a lot of help from other people in the field who work on conservation costs. And so we have some recorded videos from Paul Armsworth, Jennifer McGowan, Vanessa Adams, Hugh Possingham, and Anna Roberto Segovia, who also work on costs and have contributed to this course. With any luck, this presentation, yes, okay, this video will work. This is a little introduction to the course from Professor Leah Gerber, who is the director of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes at ASU.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Leah Gerber. I'm a professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. I also direct our Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, which is a boundary organization that aims to bridge the divide between the production of science and the demand for science to create implementable solutions to address biodiversity loss. A key component of our approach is to engage decision makers in incorporating data to inform decisions. While the conservation community is beginning to tackle the problem of understanding what works in conservation, the question of what works must be considered in the context of the cost of alternative actions. And thus far, we do not have a systematic approach where we generally collect information on cost. Maybe in this effort. Our initial work does indicate that considering costs can actually help save more species from extinction. And documenting costs for alternative decisions makes biodiversity more salient to the business sector because cost is a relevant metric in this domain. So in this session, led by my colleague Gwenna Akona, we hope to engage you in our collective effort to improve the efficacy of conservation by explicitly incorporating cost. Enjoy.
Thank you, Leah. So a lot of the materials that we'll be going through today and sort of the work that has been done in conservation costing over the past few years, decades, whatever, I've been compiling to this website. I call it the Conservation Cost Data Portal. And I don't think you can click on the link on your video, but I did send the link yesterday to all the participants who were registered, and we'll put the link in the chat if we can. But a lot of the materials that we'll be talking about today are found on this portal, as well as we've been sort of compiling links to other cost studies that have been using cost information and sort of cost information in general that we hope will help the community. So I wanted to start out with a discussion about why do we care about cost data anyway? Why should we collect cost data? And what constitutes good cost data? I talk a lot about good cost data, and I wanted to do a little overview of what I consider to be good cost data. So why are we here anyway? I mean, we're all conservation scientists and practitioners, and I suspect we all have sort of similar goals, right? We're here because we sort of value natural communities or natural systems in some way, and we want to ensure that they persist into the future. So we work in this world. We care about natural systems and we want them to persist. So this is my favorite natural system. This is a wet prairie in Northwest Florida. But these systems, conservation of these systems requires some kind of intervention. And so here I have pictures of sort of very land management based interventions, but they don't have to be things like this too. They can also be things like education. They can be things like changing policy. They can be things like, developing management plans or conservation plans or sort of outreach plans to ensure the conservation of the systems or the species that we care about. But I like to just remind people that when we talk about conservation, we're talking generally about some kind of intervention, and these interventions generally take money, right? We have to do something in order to get the conservation outcomes that we're looking for, and that requires some kind of investment or resource allocation in order to get the conservation outcome that we are trying to achieve. So I generally say that because we are looking for this outcome, but it takes some kind of resources, some kind of financial input, generally conservation is not as much an ecological problem as it is a sort of social problem, an economic problem. How do we ensure that the resources are allocated appropriately to get the conservation outcomes that we are looking for? And so that's the way I think about conservation problems and why we need to think about sort of the cost side of this problem. We need to think about what are these resources that we need and how do we allocate them appropriately? Essentially, we need to consider efficiency. Where do we put the money in order to get the outcome that we're looking for? And so cost data essentially helps us think about efficiency. It helps us think about what do we get for the money that we spend. But first we need to know what the money is that we're spending. And so we can think about efficiency in terms of quantitative conservation decision support. These are things like return on investment analyses or prioritization, which I'm sure lots of you have experience with and are doing. So let's see if this one works. Okay, very good. So here's a little intro or a reminder for why we need to think about costs of conservation from Hugh Possingham. Okay, and I won't mute myself.
I work at the University of Queensland, and for a long time I was the Chief Scientist of the Nature Conservancy. Costs are an incredibly important part of conservation. Why are they so important? Let's think a bit about what conservation science is all about. It's delivering the knowledge to help us make the best choices about what actions to take to save biodiversity. It's all about making choices about actions. How do you choose the best things to do, whether it be in a national park or about policies, or about saving a threatened species? How do you choose what to do? To make good choices about what to do on the ground, in the real world, for things like threatened species and restoration, you need to know three things about any action. You need to know what's the benefit you get from that action, which could be planting trees or killing feral predators or bringing in a new policy. You need to know the probability that that action actually works and delivers those benefits, the chance of success. And you also need to know the cost of that action. They're the only three things you need to know. You only need to know three things, and that determines the cost effectiveness of the actions you want to take. So you might want to think about the conference and all the conferences you've been to in your life, and think about all the talks you hear that are conservation talks. How many talk about benefits and probabilities of success of actions? Most of them do. Most of the science we do in conservation is trying to quantify the benefits of actions and the chance that those actions work. But the third part, which is just as important as the other two, is sometimes more important than the other two, is what is the cost of those actions? What is the cost of those strategies and policies? How much do they cost? Because that's just as important. If something costs half as much, then it's the same as being twice as much benefit or twice the probability of success. So I'd urge you to pay close attention to this course that Gwen and others are leading. Calculating accurate costs is going to be one of the things we have to do much more often. We're not doing enough of it. And that's why conservation isn't delivering as many outcomes on the ground. Calculating costs is not that straightforward. You have to think hard about it. There's a lot of rigour to it. And we need to gain more evidence about what the costs of action, strategies and policies are. So I look forward to meeting you one day and hearing you giving talks in conservation conferences about the costs of policies, actions and strategies. Enjoy yourself.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Peter, for telling me that you couldn't hear the video, but I hope you all heard it now. I'm trying very ambitiously to stick multiple videos into this presentation. So let me know if you can't hear them or if there's technical problems, because it's very potentially likely. Anyway, thank you very much. That was Hugh Possingham reminding us why we need to think more broadly and carefully about costs in order to get good conservation outcomes. Now, let's see. So next I have another video, and this one, let's see.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer McGowan. I'm a decision scientist and spatial planner at the Nature Conservancy, working on global conservation strategies and prioritization. I'm also the managing director of a spatial planning tool called Marksan, which helps solve problems related to where and how we allocate conservation actions in space and time that minimizes impacts to people and industry. By now, you'll have hopefully watched the 5-minute animation of the CARE principles. In good conservation planning, we strive to develop networks that are connected and adequate and representative and efficient, with efficiency really meaning that we want to get the most benefit for the limited resources that we have available. And in systematic conservation planning, we often refer to these as costs. These are the foundational concepts of good conservation planning, but despite being foundational, being efficient and estimating costs is not always straightforward. Costs are often difficult to quantify across space. Data are often limited. And when we bring together diverse stakeholder groups, we find that different costs matter to different people. So being efficient can mean many different things. Typical costs can, of course, be the establishment or management costs of taking a conservation action, or estimating the foregone revenue for an industry who has to balance their activities on a land or seascape where biodiversity is also needing protection. But costs can also be non-monetary. like retaining access to important spiritual sites, traditional use areas, or ensuring that cultural identities and practices are maintained and preserved alongside conservation. And sometimes it's really hard to have these data available across different planning regions and for the diverse range of actions that we use in planning and decision making. So I'll just quickly show you a broad range of different costs that have been used in MarkSAN or other spatial planning tools. For example, here in the predominantly dry sclerophyll forest of the eastern coast of Australia, experts were used through elicitation to estimate the cost of a controlled fire management regime. In the Orinoco region of Colombia, when trying to reconcile ecosystem services with foregone revenue for different production crops, the authors modeled the production values for agriculture like rice and soy and oil palm, and industries like livestock and forestry to incorporate these costs into a multi-objective land use plan. In some cases, we don't have the ability to transfer costs into dollar values. Frankly, that's most of the time. We end up using proxies. These are simple representations of the real world, such as the intensity of vessel traffic in a coastal area, or multiple human activities overlapping in space, or just infrastructure like road networks. And even the most basic cost surfaces, like in Papua New Guinea, where we use the distance to port and we weighted it by fisheries landings of important commercial fish species, they give us a plausible starting point so that we don't have to plan in the absence of real world constraints. Now, the better data we have, the more accurately we can reflect the true costs of conservation. But a lack of data really should not prevent us from pursuing conservation planning based on the CARE principles. We have to start somewhere, and often we do the best we can with what we have, and that's sometimes good enough. Other times, it helps us learn more explicitly what costs matter to the people that are involved. And once people see that their values and their livelihoods are being taken into consideration, it can even lead to better data becoming available for costs as trust begins to build between science and stakeholders and planners. So thank you for your time. And if you would like to learn more about MarkSAN and systematic conservation planning around the world, please visit us at marksansolutions.com.org. Sorry. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, Jen. So, well, what I was trying to get across with these videos is, first of all, that sort of for conservation decision making, we really need to think about costs, as Hugh was saying. And conservation decision making can be multiple things. It can be sort of spatial conservation planning. It can be return on investment types of things. It can be prioritization types of things. So Jen was talking a bit here about sort of why we really need to incorporate cost information into spatial conservation planning. How come it's difficult, and ways forward that they have used in order to sort of take available information and use it as well as possible as a cost layer. So I also wanted to just provide this figure right here, which was from a paper that Leah Gerber did a few years ago that I was also involved in. But this was looking at cost information in a prioritization, and it's showing how, so here we have threatened or endangered species in the US and their potential for recovery on the y-axis, and the annual budget that is spent on conservation or recovery on the x-axis. And the blue line is our kind of representation of business as usual. It was sort of like random allocation across these different potential projects. And then the red line, with its extreme efficiencies of scale here, happens when we think about costs and we think about allocating our resources in terms of cost efficiency. And so really, I like this figure as an example of the extreme potential for efficiency we can have in achieving our conservation outcomes when we think about sort of the cost of those actions. And so this is an example of prioritization where cost information can really help us achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. So conservation decision support needs good cost data. What do we mean by good cost data? So I'm going to give you one more video, and this one, Paul Armsworth talking about what good cost data can look like. Thank you, Paul. So what we wanted to take away from this introduction section, this sort of like, why should we care about costs and what are we looking for anyway, is some ideas about what does good cost data look like. And so in my and other people working in this field over the years' work, we've sort of come up with this little list of sort of criteria for good cost data. And as Paul was saying, it needs to be relevant to the decision. So relevance of the cost data is very important. It needs to sort of be something that you can use for the decision that you care about. It needs to be interpretable, transferable, analyzable. All of these things just mean that if there is a number representing some cost, somebody else needs to be able to say, I understand what this number means. I can picture in my head what this number is related to. So I can interpret it. I can use it for other things. I can put it in analyses and be sure that I know what it means. So interpretable cost data. It needs to be comparable. This is related to interpretable, right? It needs to be something that you know what that number means in one context so that you can compare it to a similar number in a different context. Finally, it needs to be feasible. So cost data needs to be something that we don't want to spend all of our time collecting cost data and not have time to sort of do the other things that we require for getting the conservation outcomes that we're looking for. So it needs to be good enough for decision support, but not painful or onerous to collect. Now, I just wanted to comment, somebody had put in the comments, they wanted me to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say conservation outcomes. And I'm being a little bit intentionally vague here because sort of the conservation outcomes, I think, are determined by the decision maker. You have particular things that you are looking for. You have particular sort of measurable or observable outcomes that you want to achieve from your conservation interventions. So I tend to think about the cost side of things, but the outcome side of things is, it's the benefit of the intervention. It's the thing that you are trying to achieve. And that is a whole nother can of worms, a huge amount of effort to get that information as well. But just as important as the cost, as he was saying, and sort of equally difficult to collect. We'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow, sort of this idea about how do we think about the outcomes and the costs at the same time. But mostly when in our talking today, we're thinking about the costs, the side of things where it's like, what are the inputs to get whatever it is we're trying to achieve, these outcomes. So I'm being intentionally vague, but really it's sort of what you as a decision maker are trying to achieve with the interventions that you are implementing or the conservation actions that you are doing in a particular context. Okay,